Okay, welcome to Solo Dad Smiling, episode 5. I'm very pleased to be here with Alexander Boldizar, and we are going to get a deep dive into mountain man parenting here in about 2 minutes. And I'm going to have Alex say a quick hello then. What you need to know if you're just listening to this podcast or this interview is that my name is Scott Carr. I am the founder and chief strategist of the Empowered Parents Network. I do also run the Solo Dad Smiling podcast series. And just briefly, I have a daughter that's 13, one that is 10, and also a daughter that's 8. I've been raising them solo for 5.5 years. And part of this, my background is in education, but really I'm a youth and mindset educator for parents. I'm a mindset educator for youth and parents. And I help parents learn how to reduce drama in the home. I help them learn how to become more important to their child than their phone. And I also help parents establish work-life balance. It's really hard these days. I know that. I've lived it. But I became wise enough to allow my children to begin to raise me. That's my story. I'll get into that a little bit at the end. But like Alexander, I'm very passionate about parenting, about developing oneself through adversity. We know that adversity either buries us, or we drown in it, or it shapes us. And I think Alexander and I probably share through our own separations and divorces and stories here with raising children and moving forward that passion. But before I give you a formal welcome and do your bio here, Alexander, welcome to Solo Dad Smiling. How are you doing today, man?
Doing great. Thank you for having me.
Okay, super. That's great. What I need listeners to know here is Alexander has a very rich and diverse background. He was the first post-independence Slovak citizen to graduate with a Juris Doctor degree from Harvard Law School. Since then, he's been an art gallery director in Bali. He's been an attorney in San Francisco and Prague. He's been a pseudo geisha in Japan, a hermit in Tennessee, a paleontologist in the Sahara, a porter in the high Arctic, a police abuse watchdog in New York City, and among all that, an editor and art critic in both Jakarta and Singapore, great places in the world. Love to eat there. Amazing. And he's also been a consultant on Wall Street. And his writing has won the PEN and the Nob Hill Prize, and was the Bread Loaf nominee for the Best New American Voices. And although he's no longer single, he spent years as a solo dad. And Alex currently lives in Vancouver, British Columbia, where his hobbies include throwing boulders and choking people while wearing pajamas. That's smart talk for a guy that's a Jitsu expert. He won a gold medal at the Pan American Championships and a bronze at the World Master Championships in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So not only a great mind, but not somebody you want to say the wrong thing to, perhaps. For several years, he had an online dictionary, had him listed as his entry for ugly. This is too funny, Alexander. Great to have you with you. Great to have you with us today. Fantastic. I know you're excited about the topic of parenting. I'm going to tell a bit more to the listeners about your connection to parenting, but give us your, couple of senses here about how old your son is and your journey really briefly. Can you?
Yeah, thank you again for including me on here. It's fun. My son's 11 and he had his birthday yesterday. And yeah, it's been an adventure. You mentioned all I traveled a lot and I've done a lot of different things. Always had a hard time kind of putting roots down, and then having a child did it for me. But this has been the biggest adventure by far, much bigger than the Sahara or the Arctic or anything like that. Just raising a son. It's kind of amazing how your priorities change. It's not that you sacrifice when you have a kid. It's that what's meaningful, what's important drastically changes. And so, yeah, it's been and then as you know, some of my backstory with the custody issues and the solo parenting, it was challenging at times. But like the topic of this podcast, in some ways, or webinar, like you said, through challenges you grow and you improve.
Sure, fantastic. And before we get into the questions, I'm just going to read a little bit more about your own connection to parenting the youth, as we talked about. I know that it was a difficult divorce for you. And what you did is you obtained sole custody of your son when he was 4 years old. And this is when his biological mother left the country. You became a solo parent. And so seeing the Canadian family law process from the inside, I know that you became involved in advocating for more equality within the family law sphere. Can you just tell us briefly, before I get into the other questions, what was your experience about being a male, looking for sole custody, going through what you did. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about that journey?
Yeah, that's a long story, a long answer. My son's biological mom didn't actually leave right when he was 4. She left 4 years ago. So there were a few years when we were basically hashing it out in court and using pretty much every other government agency in the Canadian spectrum. But it was a challenge. I ended up, because I've written a lot. I used to write for the Globe and Mail. I've written for a lot of magazines and newspapers. And I remember trying to write up some of these stories, and I couldn't get them published anywhere in Canada. I ended up publishing in an American magazine, just outlining some of the systematic problems that you face as a single dad or a solo dad. The big one was Revenue Canada, for example, trying to get the Universal Child Tax Credit through Revenue Canada. It's explicitly gender coded in the tax law that the female parent is assumed to have primary responsibility, and if the male has primary responsibility, you need a letter from the mom. Now, my ex-wife wasn't going to give me a letter saying I had primary responsibility, so I thought, well, I'll just send him a sole custody order. Simple enough. Revenue Canada said, no, that's not good enough. They wanted 3 different types of documentation. They want letters from his school, letters from his doctor. It was a 2-year treasure hunt, and I had to end up submitting about 30 pages. I ended up putting together a package that even included a Father's Day special issue from the North Shore News that featured my son and me, because we did a Jiu-Jitsu tournament together. I said, look, if I don't qualify for the Universal Child Tax Credit, then I can't imagine what man would, given that I have a legal background, so I'm kind of more versed in how to navigate the system. I have sole custody. I was on the Father's Day issue with the North Shore News, and you guys still don't say that's enough proof. What do you need? Eventually, they gave it to me, but they still wouldn't do it retroactively. And again, all of this for the female parent, you don't require any documentation. It's just assumed that the female parent has primary responsibility.
Fascinating. And listen, this the subtopic to this podcast is taboo topics that matter to parents. And so this is great that we get into the nitty gritty of if there's dads listening out there that are going through what you've gone through, to know that you need to see it through. You can't quit. And, we have the interests of our children in mind. And it's not, like you say, it may be something that's antiquated 20, 30, 40 years ago when females tended to have the decision-making authorities of the families or were mostly responsible for the children. We know that's not the case. You and I are living proof of that. And there's many other dads out there. So
if I could just jump in for 1 second, because you mentioned taboo topics. It is very often, this topic is associated with men's rights movements, which has been quite denigrated, and some of it is a little extreme. And the best example is the Ministry of Status of Women's document on boys' rights in school and men's rights. It's a very extreme document, and I don't want to kind of fall into that category of what I thought the Ministry of Status of Women was attacking a very particular brand of men's rights. My view is it's impossible to get full equality in the economic sphere if you don't also have full equality in the family sphere. So long as women are assumed to have the primary caregiver role inside the family, it's going to be very difficult for society to create careers for women that are on par with men in terms of payment, in terms of career advancement. We can't keep assuming women have all the rights in family law and then expect just sheer constraint on the females, on the women. If they're assumed to have all the responsibility at home, their careers are going to suffer. So this isn't men's rights across the board. It's about balancing out equality in both in the family sphere, which will, I think, end up helping women in the career sphere.
Absolutely. Fascinating. And we're going to get into more deeply your philosophies around free range parenting and, the concept of anti-fragility, and building that in our children, in our children. But why don't we start off, because I know some people might be listening to this by reading your bio around your background and your literary prowess. You just published a novel called The Ugly. Why don't you take a minute or two and tell us about that, Alexander?
Thank you. Well, it came out last month. It's a book about a Siberian mountain man whose land is stolen by an American lawyer. And he comes from a tribe where they choose the chief by throwing boulders at each other. And the man who wins this dull boulder throw contest is sent on a quest after their land is stolen. He's sent on a quest to learn how to throw words instead of boulders. So you have this very physical, slightly brutal mountain man who has to go to Harvard Law School to learn how to negotiate a much more nuanced and intellectual environment. And it's a satire. It's a satire of law. It's a satire of modern society. In some ways, it does fit into what we're talking about with Antifragility. Obviously, there's a theme going through where I miss a kind of a society that's a little less risk averse, where people challenge each other and grow through adversity. And it's a fish out of water story, and it's had very good reviews. It was #1 on Goodreads in September. And if you enjoy satire, I highly recommend it. I'll show you the cover.
Oh, fantastic. That's brilliant. Okay, that's brilliant. We'll tell folks that are listening to this how they can get the ugly more when we wrap up at the end of this conversation. It's primarily a conversation, of course, about parenting, your philosophies. But that's brilliant. I mean, congratulations. I obviously should read this. I've been reading so much about core psychology and parenting over the last 2 years. I probably need a break. In fact, my children tell me, why don't you just read something normal, Papa? So that looks like something that I'll put maybe on my Christmas list. Thanks so much. So, going back to how it was, we learned that it was 4 years ago that your son's mother left, and the trials and tribulations leading up to this moment. Obviously, you found it difficult to balance the time for parenting, for earning an income, and pursuing a creative novel. Like, how did you begin to get your head around that and manage through that sort of level of stress?
Well, the stress part, there's a interesting study I read when I was in the middle of my divorce. It tracked patent applications by engineers and inventors through their lifetime, mapped against their divorce. And it showed that engineers and inventors and people who were submitting frequent patent applications all seemed to have statistically a 5-year hole around their divorce. Or basically, they were extremely unproductive during that high-stress period caused by a divorce. And when I read that, it kind of made me feel better, because when things were at their worst, I could take care of my son, I could do my day job and pay the bills, but there was no space left in my mind for creative writing or creative thought. It was just basically putting out the fires. And so for anybody going in the middle of the divorce, this has been scientifically mapped out that you are going to lose productivity and creative space in your head, and it's just completely normal, and there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and you come out, and then things get better. So in terms of balancing, there are times where it's impossible. There are times where you have to make sacrifices. But I don't know how many of your viewers are kind of in the middle of the really rough patch, but I think it's a good message to send out there that it's time bounded. It's a hole in your creative space, but you bounce back.
Wonderful. I know that I found exercise to be really vital to this. I had to continue. You obviously have your jiu-jitsu practice, and you had competitions. That was probably one thing. It's probably safe to say that I know that I'm a swimmer. I'm a triathlete. I lift some weights every morning. I make time for myself. And that was hard in the beginning, but I would share that, it became easier and easier to the point where it became an expectation of mind and body that I had to exercise. What would you say about the role of jiu-jitsu in your own physical presence during the difficult period?
Oh, absolutely. I think it saved me from a heart attack. People talk about being in the now, being in the present, and there are times where it's impossible. But when somebody's strangling you and the blood's no longer pumping to your head, you have to be in the present. It's impossible to think about your divorce stress. And it's also great. The social connection is important. At the very beginning of the process, my son was abducted for a week. And I remember when I first got him back, he came to the club, and I had, there were 40 guys giving him a high five. And just that kind of, both the community of a sport like jiu-jitsu, and it's kind of at work, you have to kind of manage how much you share And with friends, obviously you can share, but the community of a sport, and where especially what I loved about it was you can't be in your head when you're in the middle of a fight. The fight or flight, the primal instinct kicks in, and they just kind of flushed out all the chronic stress. And there's so much evidence that it's the chronic stress that causes damage. The short-term stress, like the fight or flight short-term stress, actually flushes out the chronic stress. And I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind. And sometimes when things get bad enough, you really have to take a conscious approach to how do you mitigate these risks? How do you walk yourself through it? How do you take the steps through? And I'm a firm believer that exercise is a huge part of that.
Good. And here we are, a couple of men raising children, and basically on our own, and or certainly had periods of time when we were on our own, and we're vouching for the fact that you got to take care of your body in order to take care of your mind, and then it works together. Wonderful. Now, you talk also a little bit about anti-fragility in children. What has been your observations of raising kids in Canada, and give us some context for how you're raising your son. And what is his name again, please?
It's Samson.
Samson, yeah. So give us a context of what you're observing around his friends and other parents and such, and then what your view on anti-fragility parenting might look like.
Well, first, just to back up with the concept of anti-fragility, it comes from a book that was written primarily about systems on a larger scale, like economic systems, and with the idea being that there are some things that are fragile. Porcelain plate or a cup, glass, it's fragile. You drop it, it breaks. Then there are things that are robust, like an iron pan, cast iron pan. It's tough, but it's kind of neutral. But then there are things in life that are anti-fragile. And by anti-fragile, it means that the more they're stressed, the stronger they become. And economic systems tend to work this way. Bones work this way. We're just talking about exercise. Muscle and bone, most of the human body, our entire evolutionary history, we are strengthened by adversity. We are strengthened by stress. Again, can't be chronic, but overcoming difficulty improves some things. And I think our society, whether it's the economy and trying to tone down business cycles, which end up creating a massive recession because of all the institutions that we put in place to dampen the small business cycles, or a forest where we fight small forest fires, so when one catches it's much bigger, to a child that's too protected from small stresses, becomes unable to handle bigger ones when they come along. And just like a bone, if you protect a bone, it becomes weaker and weaker. And I think very much that our role as parents is not just to protect kids in the short run, it's to teach them. But in the long run, that becomes the same thing, because as you're teaching them, you're giving them the skills to protect themselves. And I think North America, because of the prevalence of lawyers possibly, or the media, where an accident in California feels to us like it happened next door, and human beings are terrible at risk assessment or statistical probability assessment. And so the combination of these things has really empowered a certain type of mindset, called the soccer mom mindset, or just a legalistic mindset, where it's all about protection, but it's a very short-term minded approach to protection. And finally, now there's some pushback. There are, and again, it's coming from like Scandinavia. There are a few scientists showing that dangerous playgrounds actually lead to fewer accidents over the entire course of a child up to the age of 18. Yes, when you put in a new dangerous playground in a short-term 6-month span, you might have a slight increase in accidents. But over the course of a child's lifetime, they will have fewer accidents when they're exposed to dangerous playgrounds, because they learn to assess the risk themselves rather than having it assessed for them by parents or educators or the nanny state. And that's not even factoring in diabetes and obesity and all the other kind of, and anxiety. Just purely on the number of broken bones, kids exposed to dangerous playgrounds early on have fewer broken bones over a lifetime. And we are averse to even listening to these studies, because our mindset is very, very reactive, emotional, I think we're doing a disservice to our kids that way.
Good. We're going to keep going on this topic for sure. And I think I'll just jump in and say, I think that, parents maybe have been mistaken to, again, believe that their duty has changed to just protect their kid without the longer term growth and view in mind. I know that in my practice, I help youth and parents understand the value of non-cognitive skills. We know now that to live a purposeful, fulfilled, happy, successful life, that non-cognitive skills, grit, character, perseverance, what have you, are the skills that are going to hold us in much better chance of achieving that kind of a life than the cognitive skills, which is the math, the science. And here we are, we're throwing all our kids in Kumon, getting extra tutors. That's great for the cognitive development to get our kids to university, but what about the character elements that's missing from, like you say, assessing their own risks, making up their own mind, deciding what they can and can't do? I mean, education, in some ways, it's hard to hear this if there's educators listening, but education in some ways becomes the first true limiting experience for children, doesn't it? Where they become compartmentalized into A's, B's, and C's. And, what are your thoughts on non-cognitive skills and cognitive skills and anything else?
I want to touch on the last bit, what you said first, and I'll come back to that. But there's a philosopher, Ivan Illich, who wrote 40 years ago about this concept of counterproductivity. And he said every institution ends up working against the ends for which it was created. And I think our education system is very much guilty of that. If you look at the root of the word education, it's Latin e, which means out, and ducare, which means pull. So the idea is pulling out the maximum potential from a child. And we've replaced that with stuffing them full of information. And I think within Canada, it has shifted from purely the academic skills, but even the non-cognitive skills that they're focused on, they're important, but they're dominant. They're dominated by very, I don't know what the word is, but a very careful kind of. The word politically correct has been abused lately, so I don't want to use it.
Yeah, but I understand what you're saying.
But it's for example, the skills they teach is bullying is bad, empathy type skills, which are important, but they're putting no stress at all, from what I can see, on, for example, this resilience idea and bouncing back. And even with the anti-bullying, the inflation, the word inflation of what constitutes bullying. I came to Canada as an 8-year-old boy. I didn't speak the language. I was a smartass. I was getting beaten up on a weekly basis. And when I could stand up for myself, I was held up against a tree with a knife to my throat by a group of boys, because we were poor. We lived in the worst neighborhood. I was an outsider. And to me, that's what bullying means. And we've expanded that to a mean word. My son got in trouble once at school because the monitors, who were a couple of grades older, were taking kids' lunches. They were forcing them to stand on chairs. They were on power kick. And Samson called one of the monitors, who was, again, a year older, he called him mean. And so they punished him for using the word mean. And so when I found out, I went to talk to the teacher, and she was saying, well, he shouldn't have said that. And I said, do you have the whole context here? Like, these monitors were completely abusing their power. And sure enough, the monitors were disciplined, and they lost the right to be lunch monitors. But just the fact that my son has stood up for himself, he didn't, Otoshi, he didn't throw the kids down on the ground. He didn't fight them. He just called them that they're acting mean. And even that was a level of, well, he shouldn't have said that. And what we're teaching is we're teaching victimhood. We're doing it in the guise of protecting victims, but what we're really doing is we're creating the attributes of victim-like behavior. Now, I'm completely against bullying. I was bullied. But I think you do need to deal with some in order to learn how to respond. And teach the skills. And in standing up to a bully and calling him mean, you shouldn't also be punished for saying something inappropriate. Like, we've totally lost common sense in our approach of what
we're running away from adversity. We're trying to protect from adversity rather than dignify adversity for what it is, knowing full well that any parent or teacher or child that has gone on to build resolve and make something from nothing has had to face adversity, whether that's been socioeconomic, what have you, and I think that the other piece that we run into, and I help people understand, is that we know this is so hard in this commercialized instant gratification based society, whereas the reality of it is, what we know is that our incomes as parents does not translate to a certain IQ or a certain desire factor or motivation factor in our children. Have you come across that at all in terms of your observations around, the people that you are connected to at your club and in your work? I mean, do people have that figured out in terms of balancing, leadership with their children aside from buying them things, and around material objects?
Yeah, I in some ways, I've often found that the kids of single parents are by far the most interesting because, not necessarily because it's a thought out approach to parenting, but the sheer lack of time on the part of the parent forces the kids to be more independent and to grow and to get a sense of balance in life. Whereas again, this is generalizing, but on a statistical basis, I would say that the richer kids are often more taken care of. One of the reasons I moved back to Vancouver, we're living in Bali when Samson was up until the age of 3. And I didn't want him growing up in Bali because I saw all the expat kids were so used to telling the nannies, the pembantus, the helpers, what to do. And I didn't want my son bossing around an adult. And there was just no way to convince the nannies not to let the child boss them around because they thought their job depended on it being liked by the child. And I thought, there's no way Samson's growing up in a society where you have a 5-year-old bossing out around an adult. And so that was that wasn't the main factor, but we moved a year before that because my ex-wife had a mental breakdown. But we're planning on moving anyway just to avoid that childhood. I saw it as a threat. Whereas it basically was a function of a higher socioeconomic status than the people around us. And yeah, I've definitely seen that.
I want to get into some of the things that you and Samson do in the home. I know that you mentioned one or two things that you do while you cook or the chores that he does. We can reflect on that in a minute, because I recall in our conversation about 6 weeks ago that you shared some really interesting things that you like to do around antifragility. But just tell us, can you share it all without, maybe the level of detail that you're comfortable with in terms of, what was it like for Samson to see his mother go through that? And how did you navigate him through, a mental breakdown, as you put it, and while still trying to have him, connect to who his mother was and what the future was going to hold? Can you tell us a little bit about the challenges there and your approach?
Yeah, that was tough, and I don't think there's one answer. I think I'm a big believer in situationality and kind of judging each situation based on its own characteristics, and dealing with somebody with a mental illness, it's almost like every situation, every day is different. But there was definitely initially, there were issues where he was starting to have nightmares. This was before the divorce. Then with the divorce, I was really concerned about, main thing I was concerned, my ex-wife is American, and she was threatening to take him down to the States. And so I was terrified that I'd wake up and they'd be gone. She said, if we divorce, I'm taking him to the States. And then with the abduction and everything, once I got the sole custody, the fear never stopped. And then I became what psychologists call hypervigilant. I'd hear an ambulance or a fire truck if he was, because I got sole custody, but she still had 50% visitation. And it was, at least initially, she lost that later, but initially it was a horrible feeling taking him over there. He'd be crying, begging me not to, and I had no choice. I knew that if I went against a court order, I'd lose my sole custody, and at least with the sole custody, I knew that she couldn't take him again.
Okay.
And so yeah, it was hell for a couple of years. In terms of helping him through it, initially it was just spending a lot of time with him, really focused on him. I think what you were referring to initially was when it was just him and I. The minute his mom left the house, I I took the entire backyard, ripped up all the plants and the flowers, and turned it into an obstacle course for him.
Okay.
And cemented in some gymnastics rings, created, and I'm not handy with my hands. I end up mixing quickcrete without gloves, and end up cracking up my. I know I'm good at what I'm bad at, and building things is not something I'm good at. But you know,
throwing boulders, yes. Cementing Olympic rings into the backyard, not so much. That's great.
When you're that, you do what you have to. And so I put in rock climbing holds all around the kitchen, so that when I was cooking, he'd be climbing the walls. And you know, it felt really liberating because, and I really don't want to get into it. Like, gender keeps coming into this, but I think generally women prefer a beautiful house or an attractive looking house, and a lot of men are much more functional. And for me, it was such a relief to have control over my own space again. And I turned the house into something that was both fun and a learning space for him. You know, I had to cook him dinner, so instead of having him on a video game, by having rock climbing walls all around the kitchen, it was more fun for him to hang off the ceiling and watch and talk to me while I cooked. And you introduced the webinar about becoming more important than your kids' cell phones, and I don't think you can do that through just demanding it. I think you basically have to make the alternative more enjoyable, more fun. Mm-hmm. And then part of that is kind of free-range parenting approaches. If the kids go out and there's nobody outside, because all their kids' parents are paranoid about them playing outside on their own, then yeah, the kid's going to check out outside, he's going to see nobody's around, he's going to come home and play video games. Whereas if all the kids are outside playing, it suddenly becomes a lot more fun than screen time. So one thing that we did is we moved into a complex. It's a townhouse complex, 64 units. The other parents feel safe letting their kids run around outside within the complex. There were still frustrations. When we moved in, there's a forest right behind the complex. So I thought, oh, great, go build a fort in the forest. Go play in the forest. But none of his friends were allowed to go in the forest. This was when he was 7. Now they're allowed. And so, of course, he didn't play in the forest. And so it becomes a community. It's really tough to do by yourself as a parent, to have a value system that is at odds with the community, particularly when the community one is safety obsessed. Because if you want to get the kids off the computer, you have to give them an alternative that's outdoors, that is not supervised by parents. I mean, you remember when we were kids, the minute an adult came by, it stopped being fun. And so you have to trust your kids enough. You have to teach them the skills to make good decisions, and trust them enough, and then have a tolerance for mistakes and failures, because you learn from mistakes. You learn from the scrapes and maybe even the broken bones sometimes. But this is how you learn to make decisions. And if it's a bunch of kids out there together, they're safer. And also, most importantly, they're having more fun than they would in the video game.
Absolutely.
I've tried to explain. At one point, Sam and I were talking about video games. I'm not a fan of video games, but he does have a PS4. And I said, look, when you're playing the game, most of the games you like, you're building character attributes. You know, endurance or intelligence or flexibility, the role-playing games. So when you turn off the game, those attributes are gone. When he goes to circus school, he's learning character attributes that belong to him forever. And he gets it like that. If you present the learning through a video game type thing, but still, it needs to be fun. Like he used to do flicka gymnastics, which was really hardcore discipline, Eastern European run, and kids were crying every single day. And Samson was in a competitive program. He loved the skills, but he hated the mood. And I switched him to circus, and he'll do 5.5 hours of circus after school. He'll go to school from 9 till 3, and then circus school from 3:30 to 9. And he's the one who keeps demanding those hours. It's not like I'm pushing him into doing a 5.5 hour class.
Wow, that's remarkable. Yeah, that's amazing. I think that you've said a lot of things here that really resonate. I know that my 2 daughters, 8 and 10, when they come home, I think their favorite time of day is, between 3:30 and 5 is when they're just absolutely, they're drawing or they're playing. I've got them in a volleyball clinic. Volleyball is one of my primary sports, and they're outside whacking the volleyball around. They're doing, trying to dress up the cat, different things. And I say that as well because I bought them iPads initially maybe 2 years ago or so, but they're so old now, the iPads, that they don't get a lot of the new applications. They're sort of obsolete, I think, for the kids now. And they haven't touched them. Coming off the summer, of course, they probably haven't touched their iPad since maybe a road trip back in July. And they're just doing, and it's amazing the drawing that they're doing. It's amazing the creativity that they're doing. Tamara is 8. She's making stuff with clay that I could never make. And so, you know, talk about being resourceful, I think, is part of maybe what you and I are bringing to this as solo dad parents. Let's use what we have. You know, let's really create something. And while, you know, Samson's climbing around your ceiling while you're cooking, my daughters and I are cooking together. We're great curry cooks now. We get a real appreciation for curry, South Asian cooking. And that's something that I wish I had growing up. Maybe you did. But I didn't have that connection to the kitchen. I want to make sure my children know how to take some potatoes, take some protein, what have you, and make something great from it. But hey, listen, you know, any other thoughts before we move on to one more question on the topic that we have going here? We got about 5 or 7 more minutes here with Alexander Boldizar, again, an author of The Ugly and a man of many worlds and many hats, a lawyer, a writer, and a solo dad. Here on Solo Dad Smiling, Taboo Topics That Matter to Parents. Any other thoughts before we move on, Alexander?
No, just to add that, yeah, my son has a PS4, but he told me the other day he hadn't played it in 2 months. And again, that's the approach I like, where you create a nudge. You don't. It's not it's not I'm fully old school, you know, harsh discipline. I got him a PS4. He has the option, but try to guide them to make the decisions themselves. I think that's very important, and that's part of helping them learn. And anyway,
yep,
yeah,
cool. Absolutely. I think that it comes from a secure attachment. It comes from, you know, trusting you that you've got stuff up. I think that that's probably a passion that we share, is that, you know, we want to create high value in the world, you know, for our clients and for people that are going to buy our products or services. You know, at the same time, we want to live in a certain way as parents, don't we? That our children are inclined to live that way as well, or to live a different way, but they might be inspired by the fact that we do jiu-jitsu, or the fact that we do a triathlon, or the fact that I'm just trying to beat my age in triathlon with my time. You know what I mean? They know I have a goal, and they know I have a purpose in my life. And I think that's a great way to live as a parent, because so often, as I tell my soccer parent friends of the teams my daughters play on, we become taxi drivers, don't we? For our children, we're driving them around, and I think too much of that is a little bit like telling the nanny what to do. And by the way, my eldest and middle child were born in China. They spent their first 5 and 2.5 years there. And so I know what that's like to have a nanny and things rolling and look at the expatriate world there. It's a bit imbalanced for sure. There's some real benefits to that, of course. But just going back, if there's any men or women listening around being treated unfairly, because we know that could be a woman in a situation where the courts are tending to go 50-50 as much as they can. I mean, I know some judges are just looking at 50-50 without really any rationale, one way or the other. You said that your experience in creating a life with Samson and making that process happen on your terms was, you know, subject to maybe some inequality as a male, you know, despite the fact that you received sole custody. You know, can you tell us more about why it was so imbalanced and what you experienced? Anything you haven't added yet?
Yeah, there were so many little details. It's hard to go into all of them. One example is when my ex-wife lost sole custody, she started calling the Ministry of Child and Family Services on me on a regular basis. And I remember first time walking in, I had no idea what they told me. You have to come in. I said, has there been an accusation against me or against his mom? So we can't tell you that. Well, who made the accusation? We can't tell you that. Well, what is the accusation? We can't tell you that. And so you walk in, and I felt like I was doing a perp walk through the room. Absolutely every single worker there was female, and it was very much a guilty until proven innocent type feeling. And it wasn't until they talked to Samson that they kind of relaxed. And then she kept making false claims of all different sorts. I mean, his jiu-jitsu class she called a fight club. So there was this constant stream, and then eventually I developed relationships with the ministry people who were responsible for our case, and when I got the same one, everything was fine. But if you got a new person, again, it was this guilty until proven innocent type mindset. and just trying to negotiate that was really tough. I don't want to go into too much detail because I don't want this to turn into a bashing of my ex-wife. But eventually she was doing stuff that was very inappropriate. And by then I'd had a relationship with the ministry because I'd been on the accused end so long that when I ended up calling the woman who was my caseworker, I told her what was going on the other end, and she ended up calling the police. The police said it was enough to charge her, but they wanted to have the ministry handle it. Ministry told me, well, we don't have jurisdiction because you have sole custody, so we have no custody over her. And at one point, it got so absurd that I was telling him, can you please investigate me so that, because they wouldn't give me a letter saying what the accusation was. No, sorry. They wouldn't give me a letter saying I can't take Samson to his mom. And I was at that point still court-bound by the court order. He had to have 50% visitation there. And I said, can you please give me a letter of some sort saying that I can't take him there? Because they told me they can investigate me for taking him over there, but they can't investigate her because I had sole custody. So finally, I was begging the ministry to investigate me just so that I would have a letter for the court to prove why. And again, on a human level, the workers were fantastic. Eventually, and again, the initial reaction was very hostile, but then once they got to know me, once they got to know Samson, they were really reasonable. We even had conversations about antifragility and how important it is for a kid to go to the store by himself and feel that sense of accomplishment. But on an institutional level, they were completely handcuffed. And it was just a constant frustration with the bureaucracy. I gave the one example with Revenue Canada, but I had the same thing with the ministry. I had the same thing with a lot of different government institutions, which are, again, because of injustice in the past. For example, Canadian judges are taught to take the feminization of poverty into account when creating alimony and child support payments. So they're basically told to put a thumb on the scale, not to just look at the individual case, but to look at gender as a relevant factor in evaluating these alimony.
Highly subjective.
Yeah, I've had Samson for 4 years, and at the beginning, I mean, I've had sole custody for 7 almost. The mom has been out of the country for 4, but for almost a year, I was sending child and spousal support to Tennessee. It made absolutely no sense. The spousal support, fine, that's regardless of which country. But the fact that I had sole custody, he was living 100% of the time with me, and I was still having to send money to another country to a parent who was completely absent, it's just ridiculous.
It is, and that's probably another conversation.
It's a
question, but it's remarkable. I think that what people, either men or women that are going through a divorce now, or that doubt that they have the wherewithal to see it through for the interests of their children, whether they've been abused, whether they've been subject to injustices or psychological badgering or bullying or these different things that people do to one another, just know that, you can get through it. You need to use logic, less emotion, and get great advice. I mean, here we're talking to a lawyer, for heaven's sakes. I'm sure it's challenging. But listen, Alexander, this has been fantastic. I want to wrap this up with maybe one more thought around something practical for parents. I know that what I would say, or for example, why don't we do this? I know this comes up a lot in my boot camps that I run online for parents. We try to talk about who's running the right chores and responsibilities around the home. Where do you involve and incentivize Samson to get involved in, cleaning his room and being responsible around the house?
Well, that's not an easy answer. That's a constant struggle. I had a very old school father, ex-military, white glove, checking for dust, and I grew up very messy as a result. So, I mean, not while I was at home, but as soon as I left the house, I became a disaster when it came to cleaning up. With Samson, my relationship with him is very much our relationship. I talk to him as an adult 98% of the time. I don't yell at him. I don't I mean, there's 2% of the time where I have to kind of go full dad on him if he's just completely ignoring what I'm saying. But 98% of the time I can have a conversation and say, is it fair that I have to clean this up after you? Is it fair that Tanya, his stepmom basically now, has to clean this up after you? And he gets it. But that's a lifetime, or his lifetime, of developing a relationship where I feel like I can talk to an 11-year-old as a full adult, and almost every time he will respond as an adult. But I think that's all. It's very situation specific about, what's the right approach to each relationship. I don't think you can have a one rule fits all piece of advice for something like that. I do want to go back one thing for the advice. You mentioned I was a lawyer. The only thing that being a lawyer helped me with in terms of the divorce was being wise enough to pick a lawyer that put my son first, who would tell me when I was full of nonsense. And she really put Samson first. And then once I found a good lawyer, I trusted her. I didn't second guess her. I didn't try to come up with my own, because I knew that a lawyer has himself as a client, has a fool for a client. So even, with a Harvard Law degree, my approach was find a good lawyer that had the child's interest at heart, and then trust her.
Wonderful. Wonderful. This has been really enlightening to get, not just your background story here, and to show that you can live, your own life and not be afraid of it. I say this often, when I talk to people, I think that the opposite of courage is conformity. And so, the fact that you and I both have decided to, put our kids first and to live a life that is centered around them, but yet not entitling them or enabling them beyond what we ought to, I think that really bodes well. So for any single parents out there, men or women, I think that Alexander and I are issuing you some, massive support, and to know that you can bring something really unique to your child or children, in this whole process, whatever your parenting journey is. Alexander, how can we get a hold of The Ugly so that our listeners can buy this for their spouses or partners for Christmas? What's the best way to
appreciate that? It's at every Chapters in Canada. It's on Amazon. It's if you Google my name or The Ugly, it'll come up. So either Amazon or Chapters or your local independent bookstore.
Alexander Boldizar, fantastic to connect with you today on parenting and everything that we discussed around anti-fragility. Maybe we could talk again soon. I know our listeners wish you well. Thanks for joining us on Solo Dad Smiling, episode 5.
Great. Thank you for having me.
Take care.
Bye.